how do you know whether or not to invest in building and launching your no-code app? That can be a really tricky question to answer. You have this app idea and it could be successful if only you could put it into users' hands. But making an investment, and sometimes a pretty significant investment in doing that, it's not so easy. And so how do you know when is the right time to make an investment? That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the reality is there is no black and white or cut and dry answer for this, as nice as that would be, but there are some different factors that you can take into account to help you at least more confidently make that investment in building and launching your app. So in this video, we're going to talk through what those factors are, simplify this process for you so you can move forward with your app and ultimately with your business. Now, make sure you stick around until the end, because as you move into these next steps and you start getting your app up and running, you want to make sure you're doing so strategically and correctly. And we have a free extended training that I want to guide you toward at the end of this video. So stick around for that. But first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. All right, so when you're trying to decide when it's the right time to invest, or just whether you should invest in your no-code app, I want you to look at two specific things. The first factor to take into account is your app idea validation, right? And the next one is the anticipated ROI you expect to receive, the return on investment. So if you make that investment, build your app, launch your app, put it into users' hands, what do you expect to see on the other side? Now, those two things can sound pretty straightforward and simple, but just like the topic as a whole, the answers aren't so cut and dry. And so I want to try to simplify each of those. So again, you can move forward a little bit more confidently. So let's first look at app validation. Now, there are lots of really extensive processes you can go through in order to validate your app idea. But again, in an effort to simplify, we're going to look at three specific things that I want you to have in place in order to form a base layer of validation for your app idea. So the first thing is, do you have an idea that solves a specific problem for a specific target market? Okay, now this can seem way too simple, but the reality is, it's really easy to come up with lots of what might be cool ideas, but you have to make sure you are actually solving a problem for an existing target market that you have identified. If you haven't identified that yet, then you need to go back to the drawing board, because you always want to have the problem and the people who have the problem before you have your idea. So while it might sound really simple, you have to start there. Okay, so that's the first layer of that validation. Now, to add on top of that, the second thing you want to ask is, do the people within your target market that you've identified know that they have the problem you're solving? Again, this might sound really simple, but there are lots of apps out there that are being built that don't really, they don't resonate with people because those people don't even know they have the problem in the first place. Now, to be fair, there are apps that we adopt into our lives all the time that solve problems we don't really know that we have, or that we might not really think about. And you can be successful creating an app like that. But if your users are aware of the problem that you're solving and they're feeling the pain points significantly enough to make them want to solve it or be aware of that problem, then it's going to make it a lot easier for you to really just market the app, sell the app, convert users. Okay, so again, might sound pretty simple, but it's not always a given. So make sure that your target market actually knows they have the problem you're solving. And then on top of that, to kind of tie the bow, you want to see whether those people within your target market who know they have the problem are currently paying in order to solve that problem. And this is the one that really drives things home, because if your target market has a problem that is so severe that they are willing to spend money in order to solve it, that's really good validation for you. Now, they might be spending money to solve it in really different ways. Maybe they're spending money on employees. Maybe they're hiring freelancers or agencies to solve their problems, or consultants. It doesn't have to be with apps or software. It can be. Maybe they are paying for apps that just aren't filling all their needs. Maybe they involve too many compromises. But whatever it is, or whichever way they're trying to solve the problem, if they're paying for it, you have some good validation to move forward with. Now, like I said, you can go through lots of other processes, but in the effort of simplification, if you have those three things, you have a pretty solid base layer of foundation, base level of validation to move forward with. If you don't have those, go back to the drawing board, take another look, and put those layers in place before you move forward. Now, the second thing that we want to dive into from here is the anticipated return you'll get on the other side of that investment. So you have the validation. Let's say you decide to invest in building and launching your app, you put it into users' hands. Well, then what happens? Now, this, again, can be a really tricky question to answer, because it's just not cut and dry, and you have to make some assumptions, educated assumptions, in order to move forward. Now, again, there are some really complicated, complex processes that you could go through, but I want to try to simplify this for you, because you don't have to come up with a specific dollar amount. I see people trying to come up with dollar amounts. They're trying to evaluate their idea and kind of like put a price tag on it in these early stages. And it can be hard to do that, because when you're just at the idea stage and you haven't yet created your product and validated your product, you really are having to make a lot of guesses. And so again, we just want to simplify it and don't feel like you have to be tied to a specific number. Think about these factors that we're just about to go into first. So I want you to look at whether or not your target market is growing, if it's plateauing, or if it's taking a little bit of a dive or a dip, a little bit or a significant dip, obviously. If your market is growing, obviously that's a really good sign, because what that means is you could create your app and your business and grow it to a certain point. And if, let's say your app-based business is this big, well, if your market starts out being that big and then it grows over time, even if your business stays this big, meaning you're not putting too many changes into it, then you can still benefit from market growth, even if you potentially don't put more money into marketing or money into expanding the business, right? So it can really just help you grow a little bit more naturally. That's not to say you shouldn't focus on growth, or that you should assume that your business will grow if your market is growing. That's not quite how it works, but hopefully you see what I mean. If your market is growing, that's good news for your business if you're moving into that market, of course. If it's plateauing, then you also want to look at how many other alternative solutions or existing apps are in that market. Because if the market is plateauing, but there are lots of solutions and maybe even new ones still coming on, well, then your segment of that market could end up shrinking because your market overall isn't growing. And of course, if the market is taking a dip or a dive, that can really work against you. And so, start out by just getting a gauge on where the market is, where you see it trending, and that'll give you a good idea of this first layer you can move forward with. The next couple things you can look at have more so to do with money. So you have your market, you've analyzed that. Now you can look at those existing alternatives we talked about. What are the price points, right? What are they charging? And couple that with the value that's being returned on the other side. And what I mean by that is, how much is the problem you're solving? How much is that worth to your target market? So if your app costs $50 a month, but it's solving a problem that saves a business $1,000 a month, well, you want to look at that too. So you're not just looking at price point, you also want to look at the value being returned for the user, because the more value that's being returned, the higher those prices for the solution can potentially rise. Okay, obviously you want more value to be returned than what is being charged, because that helps make investing in that solution kind of a no-brainer. It makes your marketing, your sales, your conversions a lot easier. But look at those two things combined: the price points of existing alternatives and the value returned by using them. And the last thing market-wise for now, as you're laying this base foundation of anticipated return, the last thing that I want you to look at is really just your access to the market. So let's say you have a growing market and the value in the solution that you'd be providing is really high, and people are currently paying to solve a problem that has some pretty severe pain points. That's all great, but what sort of access do you have to that market? Do you have any connections to it? Do you have a foot or even maybe a toe in the door? If you're building a solution for a market where you have no established connections or you have no access, it can make it a lot harder for you to enter that market. That's not to say you can't do it, but remember, we're trying to simplify here, and it can make it more challenging for you to step into that market if you don't have any of that existing access. So I want you to look at that too, because if you do have that access, it's just going to make the road a lot smoother as you move forward. Okay, so let's say you have that base foundation of idea validation. You have the base foundation built by looking at and examining your market. If you have all those things in place, then you can more confidently take a step forward into making an investment in building and launching your app. Of course, you also have to consider how much of an investment that is, and there are other factors that are going to come into play. So while I am simplifying this, know that there are other things you're going to be thinking about as you move forward. Now, one of those factors is another nuance that I'm going to just throw into the mix here, because especially when you're looking at using no-code tools, it's a really important one to consider when you're trying to not only decide if you want to invest in your app, but when you're deciding how much you want to invest. And so the other thing that I want you to keep in mind and just consider is, what's the value of the skills that you will be building as you move forward with your app? Now, this assumes you're the one building your app, you're not outsourcing it, but our own students and clients are building their own apps. And so it's an important one to consider if you're doing the same. So yes, you have your app idea. Yes, you have your app that could bring you a return on the other side. But when you're thinking about, how significant of an investment do you want to make? Well, what other benefits are you going to get out of this beyond just that singular app idea? So if you're building your app yourself and you're launching your app yourself, you're going to be building a lot of skills along the way as well, not just in using a no-code tool, but with development strategy, with business strategy, with launch strategy. I mean, so many things that will come into play, and those can be really valuable. So I want you to ask yourself, let's say you go through the process of investing in your app, building and launching it. What else can you get from those skills? Are there other problems you could solve? What other apps could you potentially build? And what sort of return could you potentially get throughout the rest of your career? So what we see a lot of entrepreneurs doing is When you invest in an app idea, we've already talked about this, there's not 100% certainty ever. That's just not the way business or really the world works. But if you're investing in yourself as well, that's something that you can be certain about. Because if you have other problems you want to solve, if you have other apps you want to build, if you have ways that you could use application development skills in your current job or career or business outside of individual apps you might want to launch, if you can find value in those, then you can also consider this as being an investment in yourself. And that's the way that I like to consider it when I make my own investments. Whenever I invest in business, I think of it as investing in myself, because you're not just investing in an idea, you're investing in learning and understanding how to execute on an idea. And you can carry that over into lots of different situations. And so when you're thinking about whether you want to invest in your app, also think about whether you want to invest in yourself and how much that's worth. Now, all that said, there are some other technical factors or more technical factors you'll want to look at as well beyond that validation and that anticipated ROI. And one of these is really just R&D, research and development. So again, there's no certainty with 100% that by investing in an app idea that you have validated that it's going to be successful. But there are two stages of validation that you want to be looking at when you're moving forward with an app. One of these is idea validation, which we've already talked about. And one of these is product validation, which comes at the next stage. So you can have an initial level of idea validation, which helps you make that initial investment in your app, but you won't really know how or if that app idea is viable at scale until you validate the product. And so if you have that initial level of validation for your app idea and you choose to invest in building the first version of your app so that you can get that product validation, you might find that your idea isn't viable at scale in the way you thought it would be. You might find that it is. You might get feedback that tells you to pivot. You don't know until you get that product out there and you start getting actual user feedback. And so if you're confident in your idea and you know that you have a solution or you want to solve a problem, you know the what, but you're flexible on the how. Meaning, again, you know the problem you want to solve, but you're okay if your path in solving it for your users changes. If you know that, then getting the product out there, the first version of your solution, is really like R&D, research and development. You are paying to figure out the how. You're paying to find the path to the solution. And that can be really valuable. So of course, you don't want to just make an investment based on the desire to validate a product. You want to have the idea validation first. But another thing to keep in mind is when you're using no-code tools, that initial investment in order to create the first version of your product, it's a lot lower than if you were to outsource to traditional development agencies. That's one of the reasons why no-code tools can be so powerful, is because they lower the barrier to entry. So you don't have to make a $100,000 investment just to be able to validate a product and see if or how it will work at scale. You can do so for a much smaller investment. You still want to make a smart investment because it's still an investment regardless, but it's much more accessible to go through that research and development stage when you're using no-code tools. So think about when you go through R&D with your initial product, what's the value of the information that you can get on the other side? What's the value of that? How much is that worth to you? And remember, what you're doing there is figuring out the how. You have the what, right? You have the solution or the problem you want to solve, but how much is the information worth that tells you the how to get there? What's the path that you want to take? So that can be a really good factor to consider when deciding whether or not to invest and how much to invest. So Should you invest in building and launching your no-code app? Well, ask yourself, do you have that base level of validation? Do you have an anticipated ROI? And remember, it doesn't have to be a specific number. You can simplify that. And at this early stage, I encourage you to, but you do still want to keep it in mind, and you do still want to make sure that you're looking at the market and making smart decisions. After that, ask yourself, is it worth it to invest in yourself? So you're not just investing in a singular idea, you're investing in yourself if you're the one who's going to be building your app. And what's the value of that? What's the value of that investment over the rest of your lifetime? That can be a really good gauge in helping you determine if or how much to invest. And lastly, consider the R&D, that research and development. How much is the information worth to you that you can get on the other side of launching your product? How much is it worth for you to figure out the how to get towards the what? That can be a really strong indicator as well into if or how much you should invest. All right, so I hope this is helpful in moving you forward more confidently with your no-code app. This isn't to tell you whether you should or shouldn't invest, but it's a question that naturally everyone is going to have when they are moving forward with launching an app. And so I want you to be able to make the decision smartly and with some of those foundational pieces in place so that, again, you can just move forward more confidently. Now, if you are moving into those next stages with your app, it's important that in order to get the product validation you're wanting, you build the right product from the start, because you can have a full scope app idea, a solution in mind, but if you don't narrow that down to the pilot version, the first core version, and then the next versions, and you don't have a roadmap in place, then ultimately you can end up launching the wrong version of your product, and you can end up getting the wrong type of feedback to what would otherwise be a valid product. And so you really want to make sure you are strategically launching the right first version. And we have a free training on this that I mentioned. If you head to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot, so perfect-pilot, there's a template there that you can grab, and there's a training video along with it that will take you through the process of strategically making sure you're building the right things at the right times in the right order so you can get the right feedback. So coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. I'll drop the link below as well. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.